Just a quick reminder that each episode could contain some spoilers, so watch with discretion. Sit back and enjoy the show.
By the way, do you realize that we just recorded a podcast while not recording?
Yeah, but I figured on this topic it'd kind of be best to kind of get some of the other issues out, Well, welcome on into another one of our podcasts with the Gamer's Advocate, where we discuss almost everything gaming, anything that's relevant to us and the community. And I've always said before, if you get 1,000 gamers in a room, you'll probably get 1,000 different opinions, but we like to take as many point of views as we can. Today's topic will be about history, but before we get into that, we're going to play a game. This game's going to be called
Final Fantasy
VII. No.
That's not what we're playing. Got it. Okay, my bad.
We're going to be playing That's Nice. So I'm going to pick a game this time. We'll do this every so often, and we'll rotate it around. But I'm going to pick a game. You may not know much about it, but what little you do, you got to give us 3 minutes of saying nothing but nice things about it. Are you ready? We'll start with calm. How about Scorn? How do you feel about Scorn?
Speaking as someone who's never played Scorn, no. Is this that body horror game that came out fairly recently?
Yeah, very Geiger-esque. Yeah.
Yeah. What can I say that's nice about Scorn? So I did see a few people play it. I like that it gave us, for a couple of weeks, an entire platform of people, Twitch, where people pretended to know what Geiger art was. I like that. It was nice to see the world of art being actually brought very boldly into the public domain, even if we had to do it via a whole bunch of people who were pretending to know what they were talking about and couldn't name another artist except for that. I enjoyed that it was short, that this was a game that realized that competing for one's attention in the modern day and age is a difficult thing. All these games that are 30 hours, 60 hours, 100 hours long. No, a game that appreciates and shows a respect for my time and the amount of time I can dedicate to gaming. So what was it, 4, 5, 6 hours long, if that? I think that's a beautiful thing. And I really appreciate that they did that. I have very little to say. No, I'm done. I
do like that the first kind thing you said about it was, I saw people playing it. Like it was definitely a game.
Glad people had a nice time.
Yeah.
Well, we'll roll over to. Go ahead.
It did seem like a game that the developers cared about, and one of the occasional criticisms that I'll have of music or games or movies that I don't like is, if you make a game and you put your heart and soul into it, I'm probably going to find something I can like in there, even if I don't really enjoy what you've done. I'll separate the liking and the enjoying. And I can appreciate that, unlike some games I've played, it seemed like it was a game that was more difficult to create than it was to play.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and stop there. Since you haven't played the game, that's perfectly a really good answer. Okay, Banana. So since Calm only went 2 minutes, we'll let you go 2 minutes now.
Am I still discussing Scorn?
Your favorite
game?
game?
Yeah. I did get the chance to play through a bit of Scorn. I don't think I did a full playthrough. Mostly because I had watched a few full playthroughs. And I would say it was, for the most part, it was a puzzle game that existed to showcase the art. And I think that was well done, in the sense of, you needed to recognize that there had to be a gameplay element to keep people involved and kind of progressing through the game. But you don't want to detract too much from the goal of your game, which was to showcase the art. And I think it did a really good job of kind of keeping players engaged with what its core focus was, without being tedious and kind of dragging them through, a guided tour of a museum, essentially. And I think that's something that Scourge did really well. I also think they really captured the mood really well in that game. As you're kind of progressing through each of these puzzles, it gets a little creepy and a little uncomfortable. And I think with Geiger's art, I think that's kind of the point, is you're going to focus on a lot of the awkward, weird kind of... I think Geiger focused on kind of insect elements in a lot of the kind of humanoid characters he designed, and it's this weird juxtaposition of a very non-human creature and a humanoid shape, and blending them together creates that discomfort where like these things don't belong together. And I think the game suited that very well. As you progress through all of these puzzles, you're kind of forced to deal with these elements that put you out of your comfort zone because they are just so foreign. They're so not what you're expecting, not what you're comfortable with. And I think that very much matched up with the art style and the goal of Geiger's art. So I think they did a really good job with that element as well. That being said, I can't remember music, which I feel like would have played a huge part in that.
I feel like I can add one little thing to maybe round myself up to that 3 minutes, and it's something that Banana did get into, so it's not a new point. But any game that can make people appreciate art, and I don't mean art style, I don't mean art design, I don't mean video game art, but I mean art in and of itself, art in a much wider, broader form of the word, is a good thing. And you will probably find that most people aren't going to go strolling into a museum and look at paintings on the wall or look at art on the wall and appreciate it, especially if it's a more modern exhibition. Or people are probably going to, struggle to really engage with that. And you see today, and we've been doing this for a long time, but today examples I can think of are sort of interactive art galleries. If you go to the Atelier des Lumières in Paris, which essentially lets you live inside these pictures. The pictures are blown up onto the walls. They're given movement and life. And it's a way to get people who might not be into art to take their first steps into the art world. And if this game could be that for someone, that's a good thing.
Right. Well, I appreciate y'all. I mean, that was definitely a challenge, especially since Com hasn't played it before, but at least you know of it. And that's why I brought it up. So it's an art game that really captures what it's trying to achieve. I thoroughly enjoyed it personally. It's one of those, it's a dividing line. There's some people who just absolutely hate it, but I think the developers embraced that. They didn't hate it because of the gameplay. They just hated it because of how it made them feel or how it looked. And that's just how some of that art works. I mean, I have the green screen behind me, but almost everything I have in this office is dark art. So I have a lot of stuff from Chet Zar and stuff. I've got some 1-to-1s and stuff. So I really appreciate that style. But yeah, I appreciate you guys playing that game with us. Today's topic is going to be about history in video games, not necessarily the history of video games. We're saying how history is portrayed in different video games. So clearly we have historical games, and that can definitely apply to this topic. Then there are other games that treat the timeline of history maybe in a creative standpoint, kind of like, I'm thinking like Civilization. Clearly you have certain events that have occurred, but for some reason the Egyptians created the Mona Lisa or something, because that's just how you went down the cultural tree, right? We are kind of fortunate to have a broad set of speakers here, because I know Banana, has a lot of information about it, but Com definitely has an in-depth knowledge about this stuff. But me personally, I just have more of a gaming knowledge of this. So where would y'all stand as far as the overall broad topic of how history is treated in gaming? We'll start with Banana again.
Sure. So I think history is kind of this, it feels a bit like it ties in with our lore discussion, as history is essentially the lore of the real world. So putting your game within a historical concept gives you a lot of existing backstory to pull from, and a lot of different avenues to kind of bring in meaning to the events that take place in your game. I will say I don't know how well straight historical fact does in video games. I feel like re-experiencing things as they happened is likely not as appealing to people as reimagining the way that things happened. I think a lot of the very popular games that are framed in a historical concept or in a historical context, they do a lot with kind of rewriting history. Games like Assassin's Creed, for instance, reimagined a lot of the motivations behind historical events. And I think they, to a certain extent, let historical events play out, hitting the fixed points that everybody knows. And they chose to play with the points in between to say, what was the motivation for these people? How did they get to this endpoint? And I think those elements of the game were very much appreciated from their player base. Additionally, games like God of War, which is not directly historical in any way, but did exist within this kind of ancient civilization that we know bits and pieces of about. And I'll kind of keep it to the earlier God of War games, which I'm more familiar with. But you can see, I want to say it's in the first God of War, the Colossus at Rhodes is there, and it's kind of an element of the storytelling in that gameplay where, like, this is how it got destroyed. And that's kind of a fun little historical event to pretend like you were participating in. And the reality of what actually happened, not hugely important in that moment. It's just kind of fun to play around with an alternative version of it. And I think that's where video games have a fun little avenue to both play off of history, but also not limit themselves to the fixed points that we already know.
I think that's what I would find interesting about when you use history in video gaming is what role is it actually going to play? Are we saying that history is simply there to provide the, as you put it, the lore for the game? It's providing you an entire set of, it's providing you a built world without actually having to really engage in world building. Is it going to be there for that purpose? Are we replaying historical events? If so, why? Why are we replaying this historical event? Are we going to be changing it in some way? So I've often enjoyed really looking at history in video gaming as coming from one of two directions. It's either it gives you a historical set of events and then gives you the agency with which to alter them. So I'm going to be thinking then along the lines of strategy games more than anything else. So we're going to look at the most obvious are, I believe, the Paradox interactive strategy games. So we're going to have things along the lines of Hearts of Iron, where we're essentially replaying World War II. We're going to have Crusader Kings, where we're replaying from the 11th until around the 15th centuries. I think some of them might start a bit earlier, actually, because they want to set the context. Europa Universalis for the sort of golden age of trade. Or you might go a little less simulation heavy and play games like Rome Total War, which are going to have a very, very strong historical basis, but very likely you will diverge pretty heavily from that as you're playing. The other is history just going to be, as we say, the lore, the world building? And are we going to put you in some form of historical event? And you're not going to really play a role in that. And it's an odd one to remember, but it suddenly flew into my head while we were talking. Did anyone ever play a game called Titanic Adventure Out of Time? This
Not
was
familiar with that one.
Late 90s, maybe early 2000s. I think about how it looked, probably late 90s.
Is that a puzzle game?
Yeah, it played a bit like something like Myst, that first-person camera.
Yeah.
Essentially, what it does is it realizes that history isn't inherently that interesting. I speak as someone who studied history. This was my jam. It's not that interesting. People are. The story of people within history is considerably more interesting than historical events themselves, which is often why you'll find that popular history books in particular tend to deal with narratives. They tend to deal with the narrative of a person. If you're going to write about the Crusades, you will write about one of the great leaders, Bohemond or Baldwin. If you're going to write about the monarchy, in the UK, you're probably going to pick maybe Henry VIII, maybe Elizabeth I, and have them as a case study around which you can build your story. Titanic Adventure at a Time puts you on the Titanic while it's sinking, but you have your own mission. You're dealing with your own spy mission to try and stop all the events that take place after the Titanic, World War I, World War II. I think even Vietnam is brought in as something that you can stop by what you're doing on board that night. So they just give you this beautiful backdrop to add a bit of color and a bit of glory, and then you're on board telling your own story. So for me, that's the two things it can be. It can either be background, or it could be putting you in the events and letting you change them. And just when you mentioned about God of War, it threw another old game into my head. The idea of going back and God of War not really being history. It's more based on myth and legend and so forth. There's a game, I don't know when it's from exactly, it's early 1990s, called Darklands on the PC. And it's based in a 14th or 15th century Holy Roman Empire. And essentially you're just playing as someone. Imagine a very, very early form of Mount and Blade. And you're in the 14th, 15th century in the Holy Roman Empire. So it's largely modern day Germany, possibly a bit of Denmark, a bit of the Netherlands. And everything that they believe to be is real in broad language actually is real. So you're living in this historical world, but the myths that take place within the forest, and German forests have a lot of myth associated with them, it's real in that world because it's what these people believed. So they give you this history of the region, very, very fact-based, but it just relies so heavily on accounts from the time that you get this wonderful, magical world built in this historical background as well.
I think it exists in other media, but it's I would consider more of a failure in in other media to say we're going to look at the elements of history where people kind of rejected reality and imposed their own version of an explanation for something. Like if you look at games like Castlevania, and there's this kind of all of these rules that are imposed around vampires and how they interact with the church, and there's, you know, holy water and all of these, like the garlic and laurels, and there's you know, tools at your disposal to hunt down vampires. At a point in time, that was history, not mythology. There were people who genuinely believed vampires existed and hunted them. And I think that's an element when you're going back and looking over history books. It's just like, how could people believe this? And then when you play it in video games, you're like, this is awesome. I'm glad people made stuff up and believed it with their entire being, because it's kind of fun to go back and play around with that version.
But that's what really is important with history as well, is history isn't static. It doesn't exist. And it's not a topic I'm going to get into, but the idea of statues that we might have torn down in the last few years or so, people would say that's erasing history. I would disagree. These statues, to me, they're the opposite of history because they're so permanent. It's a block with some text on it. That's permanent. There's no engagement there. That's just a memorial. It's heritage, not history. And history constantly changes and evolves, and our perception of what is real and what is correct evolves. And there is, as much as we might not like to think about it, there is stuff that we think today and that we believe today, and it's a little bit different because we apply generally the scientific method to the world around us. So we often have a reason to think of what we're thinking, whereas historically there was a bit more of a supernatural, superstitious element to logic, if you will. Not through everyone, but in the general populace at least. And there will be things that we believe now to be true that are just wrong. And people will look back on them in a few hundred years' time, and probably not that far ahead. They will look back in a much shorter period of time than that and just think, how did they think that? And you can see this on a very simple level. If you look at things just like the language we use and the way we talk about people, talk about groups of people, and language that would have been acceptable 50 years ago that is not acceptable today. Just extrapolate that out and think about how we will be seen, how what we do will be seen in the near and indeed the far future.
Well, games like you mentioned before, Banana, like God of War. So there may be like 10% of the information that's factually correct. I think the danger comes from applying that 10% and then misapplying how it was destroyed, like the Colossus of Rhodes. So you have a person who may not know anything about history, which is, whatever, but they learn about the cost of roads, which is good. But they also can't separate, is this fiction or part of the mythology, because 90% of the game is mythology, and so it must not be real. So you can't have the blurred lines of, what is real and what's not real within the game just to suit the game's purpose. And then that can be expanded upon, because you have certain things in other games that try to be as historical as possible, but they still have to take certain creative liberties. So if you have a game that's maybe 50, 60, 80% historically accurate, now you're applying that other 20% as assuming to be correct as well. A lot of sim games are kind of like that. But like for instance, Civilization, like I brought up earlier. So a lot of the events may have historically factually occurred. And sometimes when they give the detailed description, I forget, because each Civilization game does it differently. Sometimes they give a philosophical quote that's not related to the art piece or cultural advancement or whatever, but they try to apply it loosely to the discovery that you make. And then there are other Civilization games that simply talk about that specific thing, or they may even have a description of the events of when they actually occur, which is what I would prefer. But yeah, the misapplication of information that is factually correct, it kind of makes it hard, and I don't really always know. I'm kind of on a weird fence on that. It's like I really do want the factual information, but if it was just pure facts, then we really wouldn't be playing a game either. So it's kind of a hard line to take.
Yeah, I think I think I get exactly where you're coming from, because the way my personality works and how I'm wired is I don't like misinformation. Like, just at my very core, I find it frustrating. So for games like Assassin's Creed, where they do such a great job of maintaining accuracy on some things, and then it kind of hides that line of when they're crossing over and saying, oh, we took artistic liberties with this, and this is not at all tied to what really happened. I think I find that idea a little frustrating, because you'll have people who learned history through a game like this, and they don't know where history ends and imagination begins. And I don't like that idea. That being said, I feel like that is a me thing that I don't want to impose on anyone else, to say that, like, oh, games should either be historically accurate or very clear when they're taking liberties. Because I think that's a huge part of the appeal with the Assassin's Creed games, is we're going to offer this alternative version of historical events, and it makes it fun and engaging, especially because it kind of also creates this element of how far off from historical events are they willing to go? Are, major players in history going to be killed in the Assassin's Creed version of history and not play the same role that we know that they played, because Ubisoft decided to take some liberties and go in a different direction? And I think I don't want to handcuff developers to the facts if they're trying to create their own story. But I don't want people telling me that the Pope actually used the apple of Eden on his followers. Like, no, that didn't happen.
Spoilers.
Yeah.
Well, what you can find there, in answer to two separate points is, or not in answer, but to develop on, is the idea of a game changing the truth, maybe making the Pope use this mega powerful artifact, wherever it might be. Is a game is ultimately, it's a narrative. History isn't a narrative. History is a massive series of interconnected events and disconnected. It's just a series of stuff that happened. Whereas a game needs a narrative, essentially by definition. There will be exceptions, but as a principle, it's a pretty good guiding line. If you're making a piece of media, give me a start, a middle, and an end. And a narrative functions better when there's a goodie and a baddie. And we can have nuance, and especially today in gaming, you'll see a lot more nuance than there used to be. But if we have to juggle with the historical facts to get that good guy, to get that bad guy, I can see where it comes from. It's a shame. But I can see where it comes from. I can see the real practical purpose behind it. And I can absolutely see why in their position I would do exactly the same thing. The other thing I was going to briefly speak on to was when you said the idea of someone learning history from these games. And I can say with certitude. So my level of education in history, like formal, was I went up to master's level and stopped after master's. And I would never have done that, I can guarantee you, if I hadn't played Civilization as a kid. Civilization and the Civilopedia, that did more for me and history than anything else, than any other textbook, any other documentary, or anything like that. And ultimately, it never defined what subject I wanted to go on and study, but it really just gave me an overarching appreciation for the topic as a whole, for the discipline as a whole. And I think that's great. But it's like you said, where do you draw that line then between narrative liberty and being able to make your own decisions on how history actually played out for the sake of your game? And when people are learning from games in that way, you can end up with how I am with most of history. So I've got my master's in history, but that just means I know a lot about a very specific thing. There's a whole lot of history I don't know about. A whole lot. To which my level is no higher than the average hobbyist and probably quite a bit below. If you're a hobbyist, you've thought about this, you've read about this. I probably haven't. I've just seen movies, I've seen TV shows, I've played games. And I think the thing when you have a very service level knowledge of a time period in history, of some events in history, is you often have a lack of understanding of what you don't know. You can be led to believe that the topic's actually pretty simple, whereas it can actually be pretty damn complicated. And I can't remember what that effect is called. Is it Dunning-Kruger? When the more you know, the more you become aware of what you don't?
The element that at a very low level of understanding, you have a great deal of confidence. That confidence plummets as you learn more and then starts to rise again as you achieve expertise. But you will never be as confident as you were when you knew next to nothing.
100%. My desk right now, because I was thinking, well, we're doing history today. I've got a series of books directly related to like my master's thesis next to me. And I put them there specifically because I was just thinking there's so much that I could get wrong if I go just by memory and if I just try and think spontaneously on the subject. So I'd better brush up on it. But I tell you what, I was very keen to talk about Scorn and I ain't even played the fucking thing. Not even for a second. Now, I've seen someone play it on Twitch and that's all.
You kind of see why I really wanted to pick a game that I thought maybe you hadn't played, just to kind of throw that element of discovery. Right.
I was going to add, sorry, one last thing as well. There was a third point. It was about games and their value in historical study. Very specifically Assassin's Creed, and I think this only applies to the modern generation of Assassin's Creed, since Assassin's Creed Origins now contain a museum mode where you can walk around through the game world. There's not going to be any enemies. There's not going to be any story. But essentially, it's going to be like walking through a living, breathing museum. And that, I can imagine, if it's done correctly, could have immense value for imparting a love of history into people playing these games, but also just as an educational tool. I would love to see a situation where we could genuinely use that in the classroom. I think the only problem is that ancient Egypt and Greece are generally not that widely studied at a school level, so it might not be the most practical. But if we were able to get museum modes in video games for World War II, for World War I, for Vietnam if you're in the USA, for the Tudors, for the Stuarts if you're in the UK, I'd love to see how we could incorporate video games into genuine academic education.
Yeah, I knew nothing about Japanese history, and when I started playing Ghost of Tsushima, I was like, "Oh, this is very interesting." Because I never really thought, from a very ignorant childhood growing up, in the Texas Panhandle, my idea of a great warrior from Japan was a ninja, and, you had the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that came out and everything. And so it had nothing to do with, samurai and stuff. So
just to be clear, that's not a historically accurate account. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It's fiction.
I have to rewrite my thesis.
Wait a minute. Spoiler. Another spoiler. But now it's just full of spoilers today.
That's why I didn't get the PhD.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would just love if they pinpointed that as the reason.
Over-reliance upon the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Yeah.
The history is littered with conquerors And that's where a lot of times video games love to point their focus, because personalities are interesting, like you said, but conquerors, generally speaking, aren't good people. They're not. I can't think of a single one, to be honest. But yet, we have several games in our arsenal that say Caesar, wonderful. Alexander the Great, wonderful. No one's making a game about the wonderful Genghis Khan, but they're all conquerors and they all get portrayed in a certain way. And that's kind of what I was saying, is that I think developers have the necessity to make their game interesting and have that be the priority, because at the end of the day, you do have to make a profit, but there also has to be a certain level of understanding of responsibility, moral responsibility, to say, these people aren't our protagonists necessarily. This is just what they did. But really portraying that is a very difficult, fine line to portray.
I give you it's not historical, but I can give you a game that did a surprisingly good job of moralizing on this. And they always moralize in all of these games. So Metal Gear Solid as a series. This would be what we were mentioning a bit earlier about using our world as a backdrop and then recreating your own story on top of it. So it's quite openly anti-nuclear, it's quite openly anti-war. But there's a part in Metal Gear Solid 5, and it's not really ever directly addressed. It's more just on you to understand what's happening here. A bit in the way that Papers, Please. The game never tells you that you're being corrupted in your attempt to do your job. You are physically being corrupted, and you just have to notice later what you did. In Metal Gear Solid 5, there will be points when you need resources. So you will open up your little scanner, your little Pip-Boy, and you will send your soldiers off to go on a mission, and you're going to send them to raid a rebel base in Afghanistan, let's say. So this is where most of the game is based. And you're going to send them off, and they're going to come back with X amount of resources so that you can develop the next gun that you can take on your next mission. And it's going to tell you at the start what you can expect. If you send your B rank soldiers, expect 40% casualties and a 90% chance of winning. If you send your A rank, 20% casualties, 99% chance of winning. Send your S rank soldiers, 5% losses, 100% chance of winning. And just think, yeah, no problem. Let's go. Send the A team in. That's great. But all of those soldiers actually have names. If you go in and look, every soldier is someone that you recruited directly. They have a name. They have a face. They have languages they speak. They have skills that they're good at. And if you really think about it, you just made this really cold mathematical calculation to send them to die. And you didn't even think twice about it because you wanted the resources. And there's a beautiful moral in that game, but you probably won't even really pick it up as you're playing. It's just maybe a bit later when you think, oh, I like playing as that one soldier. Where's he gone? Oh, wait, he died on that mission to go pick up those things. But you won't even be told which one died, I think. You'll just find someone's gone.
There are some sim games that are like that. I think Settlers did the same thing too.
Oh, it's very good, Settlers.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of where you blur the line between culture and history, to say that we're going to discuss a historical event and we're going to frame it in the way that we currently view these historical events. So if you look back at, war games from 10, 15 years ago, likely we're still in that era of glorifying war. I know, just coming from an American background, I think that was a very popular kind of point of view in American media, was glorifying soldiers, glorifying war. And it was reflected in a lot of media. And I think we're kind of moving away from that more recently to have a kind of recognition of the reality of war and the chaos and the inhumane practices that arise in the middle of it from people you would have otherwise thought were great. And I think that's what you see in games when they tie to historical events, is they're not necessarily just providing you with the information. They're providing you with the perspective on those historical events from when the game was developed, or maybe they'll put the effort in to build that perspective from another time period and frame them in a way that this is what people at the time of these events were thinking about them. And I think that's a little trickier to kind of get a read on, just because it takes so much more into consideration.
When you're mentioning then about video games 10, 15 years ago, whatever it might have been, that were a bit more pro-war, sort of glamorizing it, then you have to put it into that historical context to actually look at that. And there's really two major things there. So you have an ongoing war that the United States is currently taking part in at the time. So you have to consider how the developers would have been influenced by that. You also have to put it in a slightly wider context of valorizing veterans more than they had been, for example, in the Vietnam generation. So you see how people were treated upon returning home then, how they're treated upon returning home more in the modern day. So that's going to color the way that these people make these stories. And I think you can see, and I was just trying to look it up and I couldn't find it because I'm typing with one hand and I spelled it wrong. There was a game from a very similar time, it's about 10 to 15 years ago, and it was called Valiant Hearts. I don't know if anyone played it. It was made by a French studio. I think it's actually Ubisoft, one of their subsidiaries, probably Montpellier, I guess. And it's about war, World War One, and it's not glory at all. It's just people die. It's very cartoony, but it's about sacrifice and love, and it's about death. And there's no glory attached to it. And I just think it's quite interesting to think that at the same time as you would have a title like, let's say Call of Duty, it's a very easy example. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got Valiant Hearts, and then maybe something in between, which is a bit morally, it's not ambiguous in any sense of the imagination. It just is neither valorizing nor memorializing. Something like Spec Ops: The Line, which is quite a different story, because there you've got mental illness taking a role, PTSD taking a role. But you have these games coming out at a similar time, all treating war in a very, very different way to each other. And I don't know where Spec Ops was made, but I'd be very curious to find out as to whether that's a European perspective versus an American perspective or whatever it might be.
There's various personalities that do approach, that game designers approach differently. I've seen Rasputin demonized. I've seen him praised. It's really interesting because unless you actually take it upon yourself to learn who he was, it's almost impossible to have an opinion based on how he's portrayed. So, but if that gets the people, interested in that character, then great. And that's kind of what I was going to go with next, because there are some games, and we've kind of hit on it a little bit. There are some games, like you mentioned before, Civilization, that kind of got your foot in the door of wanting to learn about history. I know I was well, let me preface this. I'm not competitive. I'm not a competitive person, except when it comes to things that I can control. Like I was, in track and stuff. But in football, I did my part, right? I was a pretty good player. Baseball, I was a really good player, but I did my part. I wasn't really so distraught because our team lost. It was a loss, but I wasn't super competitive, and I wasn't one of those, because I have kids, that pushed all that on my kids at all. If they want to play sports, great. If they don't want to play, but when it comes to things
we
that
are
I
not
can,
the same.
Yeah,
I'm a bad loser and I'm a worse winner.
And all of your kids are playing sports.
but coming full circle, like if I'm playing tennis or golf or an RTS, you're mine. There's not going to be another outcome here. So I'm very vicious when it comes to that. I have actually had to stop playing RTSs because I'm very aggressive. And one of the first RTSs out there was Age of Empires, which I played upon release, the first one. And I always would pick Sumerian because a lot of players that I would play against would do the tactic, which is a very good tactic of just finding your player, killing these workers, handicapping them, and then moving on, and then, slowly taking them over, but they're not able to advance because they don't really have that basis to gather resources. So I'd always pick Sumerian because they had more hit points. But my point here is that, some Sumerians have more hit points than the rest of civilizations out there. It doesn't really make sense, right? But I do know a lot of people who really got into history and they started loving history because of Age of Empires specifically. So that kind of comes back almost full circle with what I'm trying to say, is that I think there are certain games that, at least by trying to keep a certain historical accuracy, it weighs the good of piquing people's interest versus method to sell games.
Yeah, I think especially with like the Civilization games, like I think they do a very good job of presenting historical events or historical figures or structures on their own, to just say this is something that existed, it had a historical impact, it had a cultural significance. It's going to have an impact on this game that is not directly tied to the role it played in the society it was a part of. If you're curious about that, we'll have information in the game, but it's more just to kind of present you with that starting point and not present it as an accurate representation. So like I think I've just recently gone through and done all my achievement hunting in Civ 6, and I think you can play as Gandhi, and like Gandhi was not a political leader. Gandhi was like a spiritual leader, a philosophical leader. So presenting him in that context as the representative for this society in their political endeavors, in war, and the way that they engaged in trade with other societies is incredibly inaccurate. But they're not pretending it is. At no point are they like, this is what happened. They're just, this is an important historical figure. If you want to learn about the historical significance they had, you'll have to go investigate that for yourself, but we'll present them to you as a point of interest in this society. And I think that is kind of a very good way of going about it, to kind of not create that ambiguous line of history versus or artistic license. So
I think there's Civilization in particular. The thing that I always found kind of fascinating about Civilization is the leaders that were chosen and the why behind them, and why you wouldn't choose some. So the obvious example, I think, is Germany, where I think Bismarck has been the leader of Germany. Frederick II might have been. This would be more of a Holy Roman Empire perspective. Frederick Barbarossa has definitely been the leader of civilization, of the German civilization in Civilization. But you're not going to put Hitler as it for historical reasons and for sensitivity. At the same time, Stalin, I believe, has been the leader of Russia, possibly Civ 3 or Civ 4, I could be wrong. But then we've also had Catherine the Great. I'm going to look that up in a moment, by the way, and check. We've had Catherine the Great, who would be seen as a more distant historical figure. It's a bit easier to work with. And then France. So that's the one that I'm most familiar with. You have Joan of Arc, as the French leader. You've had Charles de Gaulle as the French leader. You've had Sun King Louis, I believe, as the French leader. You've also had Napoleon. And Napoleon is, obviously there's a long time now between us and his time, so there's a certain softening of attitudes, but that's a divisive figure. If you go across European history, the British do not have the same view of Napoleon that the French have. Not by any stretch of the imagination. Go to Paris, and you have a massive Napoleonic influence still present, still there, still honored, and you still have the mausoleum of Napoleon. That, from a British perspective, would be a bit weirder. He's more of a controversial historical figure that you wouldn't really have there. And the other thing that I was going to try and broach on the same subject, and I just wrote it down so I wouldn't forget, bear with me a second, was and I think this might have been Civ 6, the Kree were put into Civilization in either Civ 6 or Civ 5. And as I understand it, the leaders, and I don't have a massive familiarity with this, so if the language I use isn't quite right, I apologize. The leaders of the Kree Nation generally weren't happy about this, because you were putting these into a game that's largely about colonial tendencies. And you are putting the values of colonialist powers onto a group that would say that they fully and completely reject those. And I think I don't know how big the controversy was. I believe they stayed in the game, so maybe it was something of a small bubble. But that idea of which civilizations you're putting in the game, who's leading them, is a surprisingly, as I understand it, thought out process. And they're really trying to appeal to people's sensibilities whilst creating that part of the game, who you get to play as.
Yeah, I think there was also, oh my goodness, it's been a while since I've done Civ 5. Maybe it was Civ 6, but I think there was the Sioux as well. You had the Cree, and I think you had another native faction. I couldn't tell you. I don't remember. I know they went with Mayan, I think, and Aztec at one point. Really? Not because that would have surprised me as a civilization. It's just, I think it surprised me that they actually even considered it.
Well, they played a big part in colonization, not as a playable power, but in the original colonization. And I just checked Stalin was in Civilization 4 Warlords, which I guess was an expansion pack.
Yeah, I think that's another. I mean, I think that point you brought up about the kind of colonial aspect of Civ not being consistent with some of the civilizations that exist within the game is a very interesting take on it, given that you look at, I mean, I'm viewing a lot of this from American point of view, and American colonialism is very much a thing. For us, we probably don't even see that disconnect of other societies who don't have those same values. So to point out a society that is represented in this game, despite the fact that the gameplay is very counterintuitive to what we know about that society, it would have been completely lost on me if not explicitly pointed out. And I think that's actually kind of missing the appeal that these games build on, is to say, go look more into this. We're going to present it in our own kind of little context, and you'll just kind of have to accept that at face value. But I think there are elements of the game that encourage people to go look into things a bit more. And then in this regard, I would say this is something that I completely missed just because of, the environment in which I was educated.
That's myself. I have the same perspective, not exactly, but Western European. I live in France now. France is historically a colonial power. I'm not speaking exclusively historically, but is historically a colonial power. It's one of my favorite bits of trivia to this day, is with whom does France share its largest land border? And it's a bizarre answer because the answer is Brazil. And it's because French Guiana is a part of France. So you have this odd thought where France exists in these very widely disparate areas across the globe. So I would come from the same perspective, and I needed to have that sort of pointed out to me because I wouldn't have had the same, the same, should we call it ignorance of what that could mean to people. And then you sort of come in from the other side, which is not one I massively sympathize with, which is, does it really matter? It's just a game. So you also have that. At what point is it just creative license for the sake of amusement? Like I say, I don't have much truck with that, but you could potentially look at it in that way if you wanted to as well. At what point do we make these changes for the sake of gameplay? Because ultimately it's a game.
Yeah, and I think especially with Civilization, you get into that kind of issue of Civilization very much has its style of gameplay. And if you want to see the representation of historically significant cultures, you're not going to be able to match those cultures up to the gameplay across the board. It just doesn't work. They're two varied cultures existing across the world, and they don't all line up with the way the game works. But does that mean we don't represent them, or does that mean we take that license to make sure that they exist within the game as, representation, and it's just inaccurate? You need to kind of take that responsibility on yourself to go figure out where those inaccuracies exist.
Well, that would be on the same subject. I would then question, is it a lack of imagination on the developer's part if they're unable to incorporate these other civilizations into the game in a way that's maybe more reflective of who they were and who they perceive themselves to have been? And the easy example in Civilization is to think of Venice. Now, you can play as Venice, but I believe you can't actually found other cities. the idea of Venice as a city-state in and of itself historically, rather than a direct expansionist power on the Italian mainland. Venice tended to exert its influence in other territories, Venetian Cyprus, Venetian Crete, the Venetian influence on the Fourth Crusade. It was a slightly more soft power, not very soft, but slightly more soft power rather than directly conquering somewhere and placing down the flag of St. Mark on the battlements and saying, this is Venetian territory. Well, they reflect that in the game by not allowing you to build other cities. And you have to have interactions with I think they're called city-states, the smaller secondary powers, and try to bend them to your influence. And maybe if you're playing that game and you know nothing about Venice, and you find yourself wondering, why can I only play as this one city? Why can't I build settlers? You might then look it up and see, why did they take this approach? And it might be a way in that leads you to learning what's quite unique about Venetian history or the other Italian city-states like Milan, like Bari, like Pisa, which weren't included in the game. And maybe there was a way they could have done that for other civilizations too. But then at that point, you have to wonder, should they have then done that for everyone? Did you have to make it uniquely French, uniquely British, uniquely Japanese, uniquely blah, blah, blah?
Well, I think, like I said, just having recently played through Civ 6, I know there are scenarios in Civ 6 where they kind of more appropriately build gameplay around the specific civilizations that are involved in that scenario. And it's more of an alternate gameplay. I mean, the mechanics of the gameplay are the same, but it's not a just go dominate. Sometimes the objectives are, survive. Sometimes it's work together. Sometimes it's, build, a market across these societies that works and creates this kind of like, sustainable trade environment. And I think that's where you get into the more accurate representations of these cultures. But at the same time, once those societies are involved in that scenario, they're playable in the original gameplay, which is where you disconnect from the way that those societies actually worked. So it's a tough one. I think if you were to present societies or civilizations in that game in only the context where it makes sense, you'd be limiting yourself a lot, and people would likely be wondering, why can't I play as these in just kind of a quick play game? So I think that's a tough one to navigate.
Well, there are a couple of examples, and I think, but they're more modern historical games. Games like Mafia, LA Noire. They're American games, but they don't obviously cover all issues during that time period. But a significant amount of immersion due to their coverage of it being the way it was. You have the vehicles and the type of rules and the overall thought processes of certain things, and how they're quick to make certain decisions based on the culture at the time. So it actually kind of works in that regard, because they're using history as their point of reference, and it lends that immersion to really sell the story. But yeah, they're few and far between.
Well, that's interesting to me what you were just saying then, is games using their context, and that being the history. So, sorry, getting their context from their history. So LA Noire setting itself when it does, Mafia setting itself when it does. I love the idea, actually, that games in and of themselves are also historical documents. If a game is based now, today, we've got a game released in 2024 that is set to take place in 2024. I love the idea that in and of itself then becomes a historical document for the era that we're currently in.
Right.
And I can't remember what game it was, but I remember a few months ago, I was playing something from my Steam backlog that was probably released in 2006, 2007. I remember at one point the character got a flip phone out. And there was just that moment of, we did have those. and I kind of miss mine. And that odd moment of the game showing me, communicating to me the history of the world, that is almost more useful than any newspaper article from the time would actually have been. That 5 minutes I spent in that game of my character navigating that world, seeing they still had a landline telephone hung up on the wall in their home, seeing they still had probably like a big, what do they call them, CRT monitor?
CRTs.
Yeah, I wasn't sure for a second.
If only we had an electrical engineer in the group.
Cathode ray tubes.
Lucky us.
Not me. That's Banana. That's not
No,
me.
That idea.
I would have corrected you if you were wrong.
You're not here for fun. This is a mirthless quest towards knowledge.
Oh yeah.
If the 6 episodes up until now haven't made that clear, we are not here for fun.
No one is going to be entertained by this podcast by design.
Yeah. We can write jokes. We choose not to.
It's a deliberate.
Yeah. But yeah, that idea, of games, they can be based in history and therefore act as a sort of secondary historical document. But I love the idea of them being almost a primary source for what a time was like. A game based in its time, from its time, developed in its time, and what then that can tell us about society. And the fact that maybe in 50 years' time, if we're all still kicking around, maybe we can show our great-grandchildren, wherever that would be, heavy rain, and show them how homes used to look. Because you get that 5 minutes walking around in the house at the very start, and you will be able to show them this is what society looked like.
Yeah, you look at again, another game game series that probably Banana doesn't care for, but some of those Telltale games, not the fantasy ones, but like Life is Strange. Well, that's not a Telltale, but it's in that same kind of spirit where you have choices and those choices have consequences and they can be permanent. But a lot of them set their time and place in the 80s, 90s. And I think there's a reason for that, though. So back in the early 90s, yes, we had cell phones. They weren't common. We had pagers. You'd go get a page. You'd go call somebody on the phone at the convenience store and say, what do you need? And then if it was really urgent, they would put 911. We had all this stuff. But my point here is that communicating back then, it wasn't as easy as it is now. So you take a game like Life is Strange and put it in the early 90s or something. You can use that historical truth of not being able to communicate quickly and having to go experience these things for yourself. Say, I need you to come over. I got to show you this. Well, can't you just take a picture and send it to me? No, I can't.
Yeah, we could literally be FaceTiming right now.
Yeah.
And that's where you get context, historical context,
right.
And geographical context. The one I was thinking of at the same time was it's an old trope, but think of the TV show Breaking Bad, which can only really exist in a certain time period in a certain country. You couldn't have that taking place generally in Europe because someone gets the diagnosis. They're not going to go and need to get all of that money immediately for the treatment. Now, there is a bit more to it, of course. Would he have wanted to become rich anyway to try and provide this legacy rather than just getting treatment? But the roots of the story right there is rooted in a very specific time and a very specific place.
Well, I think you've definitely kind of highlighted an element of it with historical representation in games. I think there are things that we think of as history and things that we think of as a different category, despite the fact that they're really not. Like you talked about that revelation that we used to have flip phones, and it's just an element of life that we've kind of forgotten about because we've moved past it. And I think having that kind of accurate representation of what the day-to-day was like in a time period is not always something that's prioritized. And I think sometimes it's deliberately prioritized to leave things out to just capture elements of that historical time and place. As an example, I think more recently, a lot of people have really fallen in love with the Stranger Things series. And the Stranger Things, a lot of people will say very much captures a time period. But Stranger Things really only captures the good things about that time period. There are a lot of things that, from just surviving through that day-to-day in that area, you're not looking back on as fondly, and those things are conveniently left out. And I think that's kind of how historicity and nostalgia kind of play a similar role. Is we're going to capture the nostalgia of the 80s in Stranger Things. We're not going to capture the tedium of the 80s in Stranger Things because nobody wants to go back and dwell on that part of it. And I
Yeah.
think video games do the same thing. They'll capture the nostalgic elements of a time period. I think of like the Fallout series, where everything kind of goes back to this 1950s, 1940s America. It doesn't necessarily bring all of the horrible things from that era with it. They might be in there. They might be downplayed a bit, but most of it's just kind of music or the technology being somewhat limited, and you don't think of it as the complete package of that time period.
Right. I saw a meme recently where it was this nostalgic thing where like these two kids were on the ground and you had a ramp and the person riding the bike was riding over their friends and says, I remember when this used to be our form of entertainment instead of video games. I'm like, no, we didn't do that all day. I lived the 80s. I was there. We jumped over our friends and then we went over to the house and played Atari or something.
And
I
sometimes
just
it was
love memes
bored.
like that because they don't show the like, yeah, and then I landed on my friend and he was paralyzed. Like, yeah, there are elements of the past that we look back on fondly and we shouldn't. I feel like you're ignoring that part of it.
Well, that's the definition of nostalgia. And that
Yeah.
is ultimately it's the definition of rose-tinted glasses.
Mm-hmm.
And when you were saying about like the day-to-day life, that's an interesting thing as well. Is the problem with day-to-day life in historical games? And now, if we go a bit further, and so I studied like medieval history. That was my thing. So for me, anything after sort of 1650 is not history. Like that's like journalism. Yeah, that's current affairs. But if we go back to the period I'm familiar with, we just don't know a lot because a lot of time has passed and we didn't write stuff down. Not nearly to the extent that we should possibly have been doing it. And that's going to be from a lack of interest. It's going to be from a lack of people being literate. And the example that I kind of had with me is it's on my desk. And I deliberately picked it up like for this reason. It was my specialist subject, which is weird because I kind of look like I'm on Mastermind right now. That is a very specific reference. The First Crusade. We know probably more about that than we do of almost any other event of its time. I've got in my hand one book. That's the Gesta Francorum, or the Deeds of the Franks. I've got in my hand another book. This is Fortune of Chartres, and that's an account of the journey to Jerusalem. And I don't have, because I can't find a copy, the book written by Raymond of Aguier. Those three books are the three sole accounts we have written of the First Crusade, written by contemporaries of it who were actually on the journey. That's it. 3. For possibly one of the most epochal events at the time. 3. And that's why we don't know jack generally about the everyday life of people, is if you can only get 3 writers to write about that, no one's writing about toilet habits. No one's writing about life. And you have to really do a lot of creativity to create these worlds and what they might have been like. And I think that's where a lot of historical writing in particular, not so much nowadays, always had this very, very nice, bright view. And you get this a lot in fantasy in particular, Tolkien fantasy. It's very bright. Life's just nice most of the time until the big bad thing is happening. That's where I often enjoyed more things that were on the lines of the Game of Thrones style of fantasy, which is actually pretty damn dark. Because the average person's life was hard. The average person's life wasn't easy. The average person's life on a daily basis could end. And that, I think, is something that's also very hard to put into a game because that's just thoroughly depressing. Mm-hmm. And I don't necessarily want to play in my escapism hour. I don't want to play struggle. That's not a struggle to kill a boss. That's not a struggle to save the world. I don't want it to be a struggle to drink water.
Yeah. And I think you've also hit on another element of history that makes history in any medium a bit difficult, and that is we don't write about, or at least until very recently, we don't write about what is mundane to us as history. So that day-to-day life, people are like, yeah, everyone knows what day-to-day life is about. I don't need to journal this. I don't need to detail what I do every day because everyone knows that. And then a few hundred years go by and none of us know any of what they're talking about. So I think that's where you kind of, in any form of media, you have to recognize that disconnect to say there are things we don't know. We're imagining here. We're going to do our best, but that's the nature of history. Is we have only what we know, and we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah, and we have to accept there's a lot more we don't. And you can see it in the modern day. You can see it in today. Now, today is a bit weird because of the growth of social media, where you do have a lot more of the banality. But even that isn't normally real banality. Think of the nicely framed photos with the perfect meal, with the infinity pool in the background, living my best life on a Tuesday. That's not my Tuesday. You know, my Tuesday, I'm lucky if there's like a regular bowel movement in it. Then I know things are going well. But think of the newspaper. The newspaper isn't a long, dispassionate list of every event that took place that day. It doesn't list all the murders that didn't happen, for obvious reason. I'm not saying it should. What we chronicle is the more interesting, is the more unusual, is out of the mundane. And if we just take that back a few hundred years to when we just have a massive paucity of sources in comparison to what's available today, and then go a few hundred years back further than that, we're lucky if we've got anything about the banality of life. And that's where we often have to end up working with the archaeological record, which is notoriously difficult to work with.
It's funny you say that, because I always like to, well, not always, but I mean, I like to bring an extreme example to kind of prove a point sometimes, even if it's not the correct example or correct assessment or whatever. I just like to make a little point. But archaeologically speaking, I mean, even if we take certain historical records, we choose to believe what we want to believe based on scientific, analysis and whatnot. But like, you take like the mammoths. What if the mammoths were actually our foes in the past? Humanity had to wipe them out because they were just so hyper aggressive against humanity. And you're like, well, that doesn't sound right. I mean, that's probably not correct. The only thing we have recorded on the walls was us throwing spears at mammoths. So we could take that in context and say, oh, they were just hunter-gatherers back then. No, that was us trying to like tell humanity, stay away from these guys.
I'm sensing
mammoths invented the your mama joke, and that's exactly what is being represented in those drawings.
And it's a bitter war that hasn't ended to this day.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, we wiped them out
over here in Europe. I know it's different over there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one, I guess we're coming up on an hour now, but one other point I wanted to bring up is, we can go longer for sure. But it takes very similar to like the time periods that we know and trying to apply a game to that time period. I think sports is really interesting because they sometimes more recently have been taking legends from certain games, and it's that whole adage of like, could so-and-so play in our time and still be just as good and things like that. And now you can take the stats of those players and put them in a game with modern players and, find out. But then again, we're still using our controller or whatever to make that determination. So we may still suck and the player could be, really good. So it doesn't really prove that point. But I think it's kind of interesting that there have been like some baseball games, some basketball games where you can put Jordan up against, Kobe or whatever. And I think those are really interesting too, because on a more lighthearted nature, we couldn't be able to do that if we didn't have those points of data and be able to apply them in a game. So,
well, oddly enough, and it's interesting that actually we've come to sports in the final moments of the previous podcast and in this one. You have a very, very simple version of alternate history right there. As soon as you step Muhammad Ali into the UFC octagon in your game, you are living out this entirely different reality that we could never have done, like you say, outside of video gaming, outside of purely just a theoretical exercise in the mind. And I love that idea of sports offering up alternate history in that way, which I had not considered.
Yeah, I think, again, sports is a very kind of unique point of view on that, given that I think there are events within sports history that actually had a dramatic impact outside of the sport. And we've chronicled events like that, things like, Olympic finishes, things like the Miracle on Ice game. They've been tied to media and other forms. I think in those events, it matters, but I think generally outside of those specific things, the outcome within sports games is not really tied to anything beyond the sport itself. And that's kind of exactly where you thrive with alternate history, to say, what if things played out differently? And as long as you could just kind of compartmentalize that, things can play out however you want them to. And again, sports has a unique advantage in that regard of, overwhelmingly, it's not going to impact too much outside of the sport, with a few exceptions. So why not just say something else happened?
I love that. I love that for the very compartmentalized alternate history. Yeah, if we do go down the classic route of someone goes and baby Hitler, no, we don't know what comes after that. The game that I briefly mentioned earlier, Titanic, you have these irrelevant things that you're doing, like finding a copy of Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat on board the Titanic. And I think if you find it, then you stop World War II happening. Because, at some point, the butterfly effect. And I love that idea of just sports being very, very isolated. And it's just these two men in the cage. It's just these 22 men or women on the field. And that's it. And when we look at alternate history, nothing else changes outside of that. I love it. I love it so much.
Yeah, there are some athletes that I think were exceptional regards to the time period. And you don't always see them represented in some games. So I'll be specific, like Ben Hogan. Ben Hogan, I think, would have just excelled in any era. He wrote a book, which there's golf lovers out there, or if you are wanting to learn,
Googling him.
Yeah, if you're wanting to learn golf, he wrote a book called 5 Lessons of Golf. It's a real small pocket-sized book. He wrote it so that you can keep it in your pocket while you're playing golf. There's nothing like it. That is the best book ever written about golf and how to learn to play golf. He was amazing. He could play in any time, any period. He was from Texas, so had to bring him up.
I think that's a funny one, because I remember learning about kind of like golf legends from playing they're old now, old Tiger Woods PGA Tour games. And there were historical figures in those games that, like, legendary golfers that I didn't know. And Ben Hogan was one of the ones that I learned about through that game. And then there were, I'm going to screw up his name. I want to say it was Seve Ballesteros. It was like the ultimate recovery shot golfer, where he would throw the ball pretty much anywhere and just keep going. And that was a really interesting element of golf that I got to learn through a video game. And I don't know how you capture that in other media. But I know it really brought a lot to that game in particular and elevated it above, just kind of a sports simulation game. It was kind of a sports game that told a story, or kind of brought historical figures back to life in the context in which they played a significant role.
And I love that idea of it being the historical document. And when you do play, like I say, to throw up the UFC examples, when they let you play as Muhammad Ali or Bruce Lee or whoever it might be, or they let you play as one of the fighters from Pride who is long retired, you get to throw them in the modern day. When FIFA lets you play as a legend, when FIFA lets you bring back Gareth Bale, and he can still continue his career. Rest in peace, Gareth Bale, in his house, because to be clear, he's not dead.
Yes, he's just resting.
Yeah. He's in a better place. I think that's an easy way to say it, right? He's in a better place. His home. This idea of what a game can be actually outside of its very, very immediate idea. A golf game is a golf game. A UFC game is a UFC game. It's a game about punching people. FIFA is a game about putting the ball in that net more than it going in this one. But then we can apply that extra context and narrative on top, and we can actually learn from it, as you learned about Seve Ballesteros.
Well, I appreciate everybody coming in today, of course, talking about history. It's a meaty topic, and I'm pretty sure we'll circle around, come back, and talk about it some more. But of course, if the audience
want to take a moment to point out, we didn't inject Final Fantasy VII into this conversation.
And until now.
I'm proud of us.
But if anybody, if any of the viewers or want to make a comment about any games that we may have missed or any other historical figures you found,
If you want to inject Final Fantasy VII into this, feel free.
We'll be in there.
Yeah, or if you want to talk about Final Fantasy some more, just put it in the comments. I'm pretty sure one of these two will be happy to respond to that, because I wouldn't even know how, but that's fine. All right, well, we'll check you guys later. Take care.